Let's refresh this. Oh, good. There we are. Let's just make sure we sound okay real quick. And then after we double check on the sound and all that fun stuff, we'll get going. I think we're good. I hope we're good. I think we're good. So let me just share this real quick on Twitter. And after we're done sharing it on Twitter, we'll get going. Okay, here we go. Okay, I think we are effectively shared at this point. And since we are effectively shared at this point, then I think it is actually time to get the show on the road, as it were. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. My name is Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and this is UnShrink Me. Welcome to yet another episode of UnShrink Me. This is a weekly podcast about mental health. And just so everybody knows that this is not specific clinical advice to you as individuals seeking counseling, therapy, psychiatry, etc. These are just my thoughts, somewhat, mostly unfiltered, I think. And I'm trying to do two things and two things only. Number one, criticize bad ideas openly and thoughtfully. Number one, these ideas that are bad for your mental health. And then number two, talk about what makes the most sense to help people who are struggling with mental health issues. So this podcast is dedicated to you, the consumers of mental health services, be it psychiatry, counseling, coaching, family therapy, couples therapy, etc. So this is a podcast about mental health for the consumers of mental health services, trying to critique bad ideas and talk about what makes the most sense despite that. So welcome everybody. And we have some interesting topics for today. I think they're interesting. At least we'll find out. And as always, this podcast is not NOT sponsored by Celsius, although I do love this stuff and it is great. So, as always, we go to Twitter and we look at posts about mental health from various types of persons. And we've got some fun ones today. We've got some serious ones today. I'll try to start with something simple and easy, so we can ease into the discussion, and then I'll talk about more contentious stuff a little further down the road. And if you don't know who I am, and if you've not found me on Twitter, my handle is at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. That's my handle, and I'll be retweeting things as I talk about them. So I'm going to start with something very simple that's very controversial. And this is from a person named Lori Gottlieb. She is, I think, a therapist on the East Coast who has a fairly popular blog and podcast and things like that. So shout out to Lori. Her handle is at LORIGOTTLIEB1. Lori Gottlieb 1. So let me retweet this real quick and then we will discuss what she said. Okay, so softball number one for today's podcast. So here's what Lori said. She wrote a list of different things that are really important about, what can therapy generally do for people? How should we think about therapy? Kind of like that kind of thread. And number two in her thread was something that I think is really important because I think a lot of patients and therapists do not understand this. So from the point of view of just like discussing something important for everybody, therapists and patients alike, healers of whatever kinds, I want to state this as clearly as possible. And I'm going to try and do it in the nicest way that I can muster, even though I'm not great at being nice. So here's what she said 2 days ago. So this is number two of her list of things she's learned from being a therapist. Here's what she said, and I quote, "We are all unreliable narrators of our own lives." The stories we tell, in parentheses, I'm adding, ourselves, usually protect our identity, not the truth. So this is I guess a quasi softball for the day. So if you are in therapy right now, or if you have been in therapy, or if you're seeking out psychiatry, or whatever it is, coaching, counseling, whatever, one way that you can tell that you're doing important work in therapy is if some piece of yourself is being challenged, some story. You know, if you think of stories as having elements or planks, if a therapist or other types of mental health provider is challenging one of these planks, is talking about this long held belief about yourself, that might be important. Excuse me, because genuinely speaking, the idea that we have a true story about ourselves in between our ears is absolutely 100% false. So it might be true that you're accurate about yourself in some ways. So the average person might be relatively accurate about their personality style to some degree. They might recognize that they have a stronger need for attention if they're kind of egotistical or narcissistic, or that they're shallow, or that they are, a despairing type or hopeless or, depressive position type where they're just like constantly not trusting that the world will meet their needs. Like you might have some spidey sense about yourself that's actually true. But we might want to say true or accurate in what context, right? Because certain emotional states and other personality states aren't active all the time. They're contextual. All that being said, her general point, Lori Gottlieb's general point that we are unreliable narrators is extremely important. And the reason this is extremely important is that we need a PR machine in between our ears in order to establish some sense of normalcy. So the average person walking around right now, you, me, and everybody else, will tell themselves, and usually other people, a story about themselves, such that they believe genuinely, or maybe not so genuinely, this story that they tell about themselves. So like, there are factual descriptions of ourselves that I'm a white dude with blondish hair, blue eyes, and all these things. More factual story, but then there's the narrative elements of the story that are not based solely on facts, which is like, I'm an intelligent person, which is, am I? I don't know. It's hard to say at this point in my life for me. Or I'm a thoughtful person or whatever. We use a lot of like adjectives to describe ourselves. And usually the moment you whip out an adjective about yourself that's not based upon purely facts, that adjective is part of a story, a well-constructed narrative you have about yourself. And it's really important if you're currently in therapy or in counseling or coaching or couples therapy or whatever it is, that you hold very loosely to the story that you have about yourself. Because that story could be helpful. Or as some people jokingly talk about online, some of the stories or beliefs we have about who we are what we call load-bearing delusions. These are extremely important to our sense of psychological normacy, even though they're not accurate, right? So a lot of people think they're smarter than they are, probably myself. A lot of people think they're more attractive than they are. A lot of people think they're more talented than they are, and so on and so forth. And so I know for a fact things about myself that are tangible, but the things that are intangible are open to discussion, number one. But number two, they could change with circumstance, right? And so the things that we make true about ourselves, the value judgments that we make true about ourselves, these value judgments are generally like, I'm a sad person, or I don't know if I'm going anywhere in life, or whatever it is. All of these kinds of things that are contextual and situational don't have any real there. And so these stories keep us stuck. I would say 9 times out of 10, the stories that we have about ourselves, and usually other people, but usually the stories we have about other people are about ourselves, by the way, are generally not fully true, if mostly not true. So thank you, Lori, for, the grist for the mill here, because genuinely speaking, when we start to believe the story about ourselves, we usually make ourselves feel worse, and we usually don't grow very much or try new things or challenge ourselves in meaningful ways, So other than the tangible, practical realities about ourselves, like height and things like that, like other adjectives, other stories we tell about ourselves are fungible. They could change with time and with circumstances. So just remember, we are not reliable narrators, which means that who cares about the story between our ears? Maybe thinking is not so useful, especially thinking about ourselves. I don't know. So I want to kind of double up on Lori Gottlieb. I'm going to repost another one of her recent-ish tweets. So I'm just going to repost this right now. Retweet it if we're back in the ye olden days. Just a sec. So sorry. Okay. So here's number 2 from Lori. Thank you again. Her handle is at LORIGOTTLIEB1. So she put out another post on March 9th, something like that. And she went through 7 things that, think about the concept of therapy and fixing ourselves. And so before we get into this, I've already said in this podcast a number of times that my little handy reference is this thing called the broken Rolex fallacy. So it's absolutely the case that people think of their minds as fancy mechanisms or machines. Our brain's a computer, which is absolute crap. That's not true from the point of view of neuroscience. Everyone who says it, Elon, whoever, is wrong in every way, shape, and form. So your brain is an ecosystem. Your brain has bacteria and all these things and inputs and outputs and all these things from your body and other people. Our mind is this co-creation based upon experiences, right? And if you don't believe me, listen to Michael Pollan talk about his new book, blah, 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 appeals to authority. I'm not the only one that thinks this way. Your mind is an ecosystem. It's not a machine, which means it can't be broken. It can be out of balance, but not broken because it's not a thing to fix. So here's what Lori said. Here's what she said on March 9th. She said, most people think therapy is about fixing what's wrong with them. It's usually about noticing how you move through the world and deciding whether it serves you or not, which is good. So number 1 on her list of things that is worth discussing, and I hope if you're in therapy right now, if you're in treatment, rehab, counseling, coaching, whatever, I hope you consider this first thing she said and take it very seriously, because what I will say is, at least for myself, this first thing she listed here is probably the hardest for almost everyone to grapple with and live with every day. And we automatically relent to this problem every day. So here's the first problem. Number 1, she said, your feelings aren't the problem. Your discomfort with them is. So here's why I chose this post and why I think it's important and universally applicable. Because emotional states are never a problem. Emotional states are unfortunate realities of being alive. If you prefer to be a robot, that's okay. Feel free to check out the next Terminator program brought to you by ChatGPT or whatever. But generally speaking, for the time being, we're all stuck with being people, with being mammals of some kind. And so until that changes, until you can be a T-1000 or something, you're probably going to have your feelings. So the reality is your feelings don't really mean anything. In fact, if you look at the best research on emotions, they don't actually mean anything, and they're not actually universal, right? If you read like Lisa Feldman Barrett's work on emotions in the mind, they're not meaningful. They're only meaningful in context. They only mean something in the context of your mind, your body, your circumstances. But they're not inherently meaningful. If you feel quote unquote afraid or something, it doesn't mean anything. If you're fearful at a 1 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, that doesn't mean anything, literally, about you, about the world. It just means something about that one moment in which you feel that feeling. That's all it means. That's all it will ever mean. And most importantly, from her post, the feeling is neither good or bad. Even though you might feel very distressed, it's the discomfort, she said. That's the problem. So the problem is that you've attached to the feeling. That is the issue. So what I would say, genuinely, is that when we attach to feelings, when we treat them as if they are real, as if they are permanent, as if they are meaningful in a way that they are not meaningful, when we have, let's say, a relationship to our internal states that makes them essential, when we essentialize our emotions, it makes us all worse. It makes us feel worse because we're attaching. To use the Buddhist term, we are attached to them. When in reality, one of the most adaptive ways of living is probably to kind of roll with our emotions, to not attach to them. So I do appreciate what Lori is saying, because this idea that our feelings are bad or that we shouldn't have them or that they should be different is all irrational, number one. But number two, it denies who we are as creatures. It makes us subhuman or non-human. And number three, if we believe we're not supposed to feel things or that our feelings are the problem, then that gets us, our conscious mind, out of the driver's seat. So if we want to be more, quote unquote, in control, we have to not attach as much, generally speaking. That's why ACT does what it does, CBT, DBT, so on and so forth. So thank you, Lori, for the grist for the mill. Your feelings are not the problem. It's your evaluation, your judgment of the feelings. It's your relationship to the feelings that is the problem. So she's correct. I normally criticize her and say something is wrong about what she's saying, but in this particular case, at least number one is correct. What you make your feelings mean, the story you tell yourself about your feelings is the problem. My recommendation, generally speaking, to most people is stop engaging with the stories between your ears, because they're usually not fully accurate or even half accurate, and they don't actually make your life better, generally speaking. Drew, who's here in the chat, thanks for showing up, Drew, says, any reaction to the tech bro mentalizing discourse this week? Ah, yes. So you're talking about Mark Andreessen. Let me see if I can find Mark's post. So apparently Mark Andreessen follows me, so I'm going to follow you back, Mark. Shout out. I had no clue tech bro, millionaire dude, whatever, billionaire is following me. I just learned that he was. Fuck yeah, he's following me. So let's talk about this. I'm going to tweet that real quick. I'm just going to retweet real quick. Okay, so here's what Mark said, I think. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I'm so very sorry. One of my favorite posts is about his quote-unquote retard maxing. So I'm going to just retweet that real quick. This is absolutely true. Okay, so it was on a podcast, I think, where he made some comment about introspection, I think. Let me see if I can find it. I'm having a hard time finding it. But Drew, you're talking about, Andreessen, and you're talking about Elon talking about introspection, right? I think I can find it. Okay. Well, I can't find the specific post, Mark and everyone else, but here's what I will do in the meantime, in the interim. So basically, just to summarize, and this might be a completely inaccurate summary, but you tell me, Drew, if I'm getting this right. Hold me accountable. But basically, Mark said there's no point in doing much introspection. Some of the most successful people on the planet don't really think a whole lot. They just kind of do things, right? And what I would say is, I would say it's 95% true. I think Mark is 95% accurate. I think that there are a lot of people who are so skilled or talented or intelligent or just well trained that they can do things very habitually without much thinking, let's say conscious effort and processing and making sense of things or planning, and just succeed, right? So if you're a really good coder and you don't have to think a whole lot, you just kind of do things in a flow state. So I would say Mark is 95% correct because genuinely speaking, as he calls it, retard maxing, but like this idea that you're not thinking a whole lot and you're just kind of doing things is a great way for many, if not most people, to be less miserable. For most people spend way too much time between their ears and not really in some kind of flow state or in some mindful, just quasi-detached way of functioning. Now, there's obviously the antisocial, impulsive types who are out there hedonistically just reacting and hurting people, but I don't know that that's the vast majority of people. I think the average person who is of average intelligence and skills and capabilities, if they thought just a little bit less, probably would be much happier and just focused more on the things that are intrinsically valuable to them, like hanging out with people, laughing, eating a little better, sleeping a little better, so on and so forth. Because why are we thinking about all this crap? Like, this is just me, and, feel free to cancel me for this, but why should I give two shits about what's happening in Iran right now? I'm here in Los Angeles, California, and I'm sure this is going to give me all sorts of hell. So come at me right-wingers, come at me left-wingers. And I can't imagine caring about whatever insane decisions the president is making to burn billions of dollars, to keep the military industrial complex alive, to bomb places and all these things and put our service members at risk. Like, I can't imagine that caring about that right now in this moment is actually going to make my life better. Is it going to make me richer? Is it going to get me laid? Is it going to give me more peace of mind? Is it going to motivate me to do something awesome for myself, my family, my community? I don't think so. I would say that there's no good reason to think about 99% of things that people on social media at dinner parties want you to think about. Why should you think about politics? I can't make a good case for thinking about politics or quote unquote the economy or whatever. Like, the vast majority of people on the planet are just lucky to be alive. So what does it take to be alive? It usually means doing things that get you resources right now and keep you from not dying right now, like not drinking and driving or whatever it is, right? So like simple, obvious things are keys to being alive and being healthy. It's not complicated, deep, nuanced crap that requires lots of introspection that makes the average person healthier, richer, sexier, or more successful. You're not going to have a healthier family because you've deeply read philosophy. There's basically zero persons on the planet. In fact, most philosophers are miserable pieces of shit. So why would you want to be like them, for instance? Same thing with therapists. Therapists who spend too much time neck up are miserable people, and I would never want you to be like them or be around them. And so for me, I actually agree with Mark Andreessen 95%. There's a large majority of people who spend so much time thinking and worrying and ruminating on the past and self-reflecting when really they're not self-reflecting. They're judging themselves, which is not particularly useful, or they're ruminating, which is even less useful, or they're worrying, which is less useful, about things that don't matter. So for me, the vast majority of people, with the rare exception of the people who are mentally ill in a severe way or moderate way, or people who are so impulsively hedonistic and stupid who should start thinking, that's probably 5% of the population. I would doubt that it's 50% of the population that needs to quote unquote think more. You know, the 50% of the population has an IQ of 100 or less. I don't think that group of people needs to think much more. I think that group of people needs to do more of the practical things that make their life better. And the people that are above IQ 100 should probably also think less as well. Shut the fuck up and go do what's good for their health. That's probably my reaction to that. But if anyone here disagrees, feel free to let me know, because I don't think you're going to get laid more easily. I don't think you're going to get rich more easily. I don't think you're going to sleep better by thinking. I don't think you're going to eat better by thinking. I don't think most people, I don't imagine, I would be shocked if most people's lives would be improved by more introspection. Just shocked. Just absolutely shocked. So I agree with him, unironically. I think that most people could figure out more how to be mindfully present or in some kind of flow state, however you want to talk about it. And I think if more people did that, they'd be less attached to the story in between their ears. They'd be less attached to bullshit world events that have nothing to do with your immediate well-being. And I'm not trying to minimize the fact that soldiers are dying, the economy is this, that, or the other. I'm not saying those things are irrational or unreal. I'm saying attaching to them, thinking about them, probably not going to make your life better. Can't imagine why you would. So, Drew, I don't know if you disagree, but if you do, I'd love to hear any and all disagreement you have, because I think Andreessen's correct. I don't think he's off base at all. I know people are having all sorts of hissy fits about that, but I don't see the need to have a hissy fit about that. I think he's actually correct. So, let's talk about anxiety. Since we were just talking about this in the interim, if Drew responds and anyone else does. By the way, thank you all for being here. So one of my colleagues online, Grant Brenner, I like a lot. Let me see if I can retweet this real quick. So I've got two tweets back to back I want to discuss real quick. I'm going to mark them number 1. And I'm going to mark this number 2. Okay. So there's two tweets I'm discussing kind of simultaneously about anxiety, right? So Grant Brenner 3 hours ago said, "Don't worry, comma, think." His handle, by the way, is at GranthBrennerMD. So Dr. Grant Brenner said, "Don't worry, think." I don't know what this was in response to, but we'll see. And I said, "Don't think or don't worry, do." So the reason I said that is because most of the time, people struggling with various types of anxiety need to probably do something to manage their anxiety, like diaphragmatic breathing, box breathing, grounding, so on and so forth. Just being present, as it were. But then number 2 is from Mark Manson. So here's what Mark Manson at MarkManson said yesterday, I believe. He said, "Anxiety is the result of self-obsession. Therefore, the cure isn't more self-focus," kind of like Mark Andreessen said. "It's finding something bigger than yourself to focus on." So the cure isn't more self-focus. The cure is finding something bigger than yourself to focus on. In other words, you'll cease to be anxious only once you've found something worth being anxious for. So here's what I said. I said, as a successful clinical psychologist about a day ago, Mark is incorrect. Number 1, this is not what causes anxiety, in quotes, whatever that means, because there's different types of anxiety. Number 2, there is no quote-unquote cure for anxiety. You cannot get rid of a basic emotional state without a head injury or a bunch of Xanax. Number 3, refocusing on quote-unquote something bigger, whatever that means, can easily worsen different types of anxiety. So it's very much the case that when people have different types of difficult to manage anxiety, They look for simple and effective ways to quote unquote get rid of anxiety. But as I was just saying, most people do not need to think their way out of their anxiety or even breathe their way out of their anxiety. Just so everybody knows, if you're a patient or a family member of a patient, sometimes their anxiety, even if it's pathological, as in causing clinically significant distress or impairment, is very useful. It might be a signal that something is off, right? I'm going to give a completely absurd example. And I know it's going to seem like a distraction, but it's actually not. So, for people who are sexually active, and if you're not sexually active, I hope you are at some point. I hope you get back to getting at it at some point. But for people who are sexually active, literally speaking, there's a type of anxiety called STI anxiety, where if you have certain STIs, you will be sweaty and tossing and turning at night as if you have insomnia, but really it's because, specifically, of being infected and the bacteria or whatever reproducing. So genuinely speaking, you can have anxiety because you're sick, and that's not because you need to think your way out of your anxiety. If you have a cold, if you have an STI, genuinely speaking, then there's no amount of thinking that's going to get rid of your anxiety due to those medical conditions. So you need to take meds, you need to take cold medications, get your STI cleared up, etc. So there's different types of anxiety with different types of causes. So this idea that you can just focus on a problem bigger than yourself is absolute horse shit. So I hope everyone understands that whatever your emotions are, they're probably useful in some way. You might not want to get rid of them, even if they're very overwhelming, even if you're in terror. There might be something useful about the terror you experience. Think about this. Think about every superhero movie you ever watched, the Batmans and the Marvel movies and all this stuff. All of these people have these intense emotional experiences that drive them to do something important. So I do not agree that the average person should be doing something to quote unquote get rid of their emotions. We might want to find something useful to do with them in some cases. And then in other cases, your anxiety might need it to sit there. You might need to sit with it. In fact, probably one of the most clinically useful things a patient can ever experience is the therapist sitting there with them and just tolerating the feeling with them. You are not alone in your suffering. It won't cure it, it won't get rid of it, but it will allow you to feel stronger and not alone. And for some people, feeling not alone is much more important than relief from the original emotion, even anxiety. So, dear friends, when an influencer of some kind tells you what to do with your anxiety, they probably don't know what they're talking about. I would agree that the vast majority of people probably aren't going to think their way out of their anxiety. They're probably not even going to diaphragmatically breathe their way out of anxiety. Some people might need to go on a walk. Some people might just need to sit with it. And learning to sit with your feelings is extremely important. It's very important for building resilience and things like that. So I hope that made sense to everyone. Just sit with it. Let it teach you something. Okay. This might be a little controversial. Just stick with me. So I'm going to repost this. So a couple hours ago, I found this post from a person I don't think I've ever seen before. So this person that I'm retweeting, their name is at PAWALYZED, at Pawalized, I guess paralyzed, but with paw. So this person said about a day ago, it's not your job to find the wounded child in every monster. Again, this is what the person said. It's not your job to find the wounded child in every monster. And so I reposted this about a couple hours ago and said, dear therapists, because a lot of therapists are erroneously trying to find the hurt little kid who acts out in aggressive ways with other people, right? And so just to give an easy example, if you do couples therapy and there's two people in the room and they're both screaming at each other, it's very tempting to say, well, the reason you're screaming at each other in your marriage is because there's this hurt little kid inside of you, blah, 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 blah. And here's what I will tell everybody. Number one, there's no such thing as an inner child. That's such horseshit. Number two, trying to blame early childhood wounds and hurts on adult behavior can easily turn into absolving people of the responsibility for their behavior. I'm not saying it always happens. Here's what I would say. I would say 60 to 80% of the time, therapists will do this very terrible thing, which is they will explain away your bad behavior because this is what happened to you as a kid. And when I say bad behavior, I mean behavior that contradicts your values or behavior that makes your life more difficult. So if screaming at people is against your values, which it usually is, or if screaming at people makes your life worse, which it usually does, by the way, then maybe blaming your inner child or your dad yelling at you or your mom hitting you or being molested or whatever is a terrible idea. And the reason I think therapists should not do this, by the way, for everyone who's listening, is number one, living in the past is stupid. It doesn't actually make your life better. It doesn't empower you. That's a bad thing to do. Recognizing what the patterns are from the past, recognizing that you might be a little injured from the past, totally valid and useful. Living in the past, not useful at all. So it's very important that you not get stuck in the past and that you don't let the past affect you in the present if it's possible, which means being aware of how the past has affected you, obviously. But for the people who want you to live in the past and keep reliving your childhood, they need to figure out some other grift, I think. Because genuinely speaking, it is not rocket science to identify the ways in which maybe you got hurt as a kid. That's not super complicated. So for the people who need to hear this, your past is not the reason you act the way you do today. You act the way you do today because you choose not to manage your feelings. Now, some people have a head injury, so it's harder for them. Some people are intoxicated, so it's harder for them to manage their feelings. But if you're not intoxicated and you don't have a head injury, there's a lot you can do to be more self-aware and manage your emotions, whether or not you're aware of your childhood, etc. So that's number one. Number two from this post, it's not your job to find the wounded child in every monster, as they said. Therapists spend so much time trying to find the younger person without actually dealing with the adult in the room in this very moment. And what a shame, because genuinely speaking, you are a real person. You know, when I talk to patients, I don't talk to them as if they are 6. I talk to them as if they're adults, with rare exceptions. And so it's really important to not disrespect patients and think of them as children. So, again, it's very tempting to excuse bad adult behavior, and bad in this context means behavior that's not in alignment with your values or behavior that does not make your life better. Like screaming at people. You might feel entitled to screaming at people, but it's not going to give you the results you want usually. So, it's not the inner child's fault that you're screaming at somebody. It's you, the adult, who is not willing to take a breath and pause. It is your fault. So it's really important for therapists to not get caught in the trap of psychoanalyzing and living in the past too much, because then we lose contact with the present moment. And the present is really all we actually have anyways. So, dear therapist, stop living in the past. Only visit there as needed, which will vary from person to person. Also, dear therapist, if your patient's engaging in stupid fucking behavior, maybe, just maybe, Don't excuse it. You can help them understand it, but don't do things that excuse the person's behavior. If it's making their life worse, like just to give a simple example, I've worked in rehabs for most of my career, drug rehabs. And it's absolutely the case that I have never once in my life talked to somebody in addiction treatment and said, it's your parents' fault that you used drugs yesterday. It's your ex-girlfriend's fault. It's your husband's fault. I've never once made any excuses for anyone's behavior. I've sometimes helped people understand all of the various reasons that they feel terrible, and that because they're not able to manage feeling terrible better, they then make the choice to use drugs in many cases. But that's not the same thing as saying, oh, you poor thing, because your daddy yelled at you or your mommy yelled at you, that's why you're an alcoholic. Like, no, that's such bullshit. And so it's very, very, very important to understand the difference. And if you're in therapy or if you're a therapist listening, there's a world of difference between helping people understand their patterns versus using patterns to excuse behavior that's maladaptive. And learning the difference might require supervision or consultation. So if you're out there and you need help, hit me up. We can find you a good supervisor or consultant. But never excuse the monster that you are. If you're a monster, it's not because of your childhood. It's because you're not willing to respect yourself enough to treat your feelings better and have a better relationship with them. All right. So, the last post I'd like to talk about today that I think is really important comes from my buddy Nick Tabor. Nick always has some good grist for the mill. His handle on Twitter, if you're following along, is at NICKTABER. Here's what Nick said about a day ago, roughly speaking. Let me repost it. Okay. So about a day ago, Nick said the following. The therapeutic state. We've replaced community with therapists, elders with experts, meaning with medication, autonomy with technocratic management. He says, these things don't solve the mental health crisis. They monetize it. So I want to walk through all four of these things because I believe it's correct. Yeah, Drew says Nick should earn royalties for all the contributions to the show. Absolutely. If I start making money, Nick, you'll get a cut. He said four things that are somewhat controversial, and then the last thing he said is completely uncontroversial. So he said, and again, just to reiterate what he said, we have replaced for therapy, this is the therapeutic nanny state he's talking about. He said, we've replaced community with therapists, number one. Number two, elders with experts. Number three, meaning with medication. And number four, autonomy with technocratic management. And so he says these things don't solve the mental health crisis. They actually just monetize it. And I would actually agree with that very last statement. All of these interventions we've created to therapize more and more people are actually, not making things better. They're actually making things worse, in my opinion. So this is one of those times when he and I think, almost fully agree. So here's what I would say, and maybe this is an elaboration Nick will agree with, not agree with, I don't know, because I'm not sure what prompted this tweet of his, but I think it's worth walking out. So the more we try to monetize and manage so-called mental health through therapy, psychiatry, and other types of things, the worse society will do because we're trying to put a dollar value on people trying to help people stay healthy. And if you just look at the history of most species on the planet, I can't think of an example where there was one particular person who got paid, or one creature in a troop or a tribe or whatever, who got paid to make everyone healthy. We all had to help each other stay healthy. for millions of years, basically, as different species like bonobos and baboons and all these things up to early humans and blah, blah, blah. So certainly there are medicine men and all these different kinds of people in history, but that doesn't mean specifically that there are genuinely people we pay. So I do agree with the idea that the more we try to monetize things that keep us all generally healthier, because I don't know what healthy actually means, but make our lives a little more betterer, whatever. Generally, that's not stuff that should be paid, in my opinion. You know, most people don't need to get better through therapy. Most people get better through doing lots of little changes to their lifestyle. Some people need therapy, though. So here's what he went through with each of the four things. We've replaced community with therapists. So I don't know if this elaboration is going to be what he's thinking, but here's what I'm thinking. The vast majority of people who are trying to lose weight or get better sleep or resolve a problem with their spouse or whatever usually talk to family and friends, aka community, to solve these problems, to try experiments, to find solutions to these problems, and stay accountable to solving the problem. Community used to do that. Now therapists do that. Some kind of fake wise elder and a terrible blue sport coat. So I agree with that one. Number 2, elders with experts. I completely agree. Completely agree. We care so much about the next food expert, exercise expert, caffeine expert, toxicologist, biologist, whatever, AI expert, fitness influencer, whatever, at the expense of all the people that have made it to age 80, 90, whatever, and what's worked for them. I'm not saying that you can't have your experts, but why do we care about them more than the people in our lives that we can learn other important lessons from? So I agree that it's not a dichotomy per se, but I think that we care less and less about our elders and more about our experts and influencers. Number 3, we've replaced meaning with medication. So people use all sorts of drugs. People use all sorts of drugs to lose contact with the present moment. The present moment is your only source of meaning, literally. And so whatever drugs you're doing to lose contact with the present moment, which is unbearable for some reason, and for many people it is. Many people currently, right now, are in the middle of a war. They're being bombed. They're being stabbed, shot at, right? So them checking out from the present moment might make sense to some degree, but you might also need to be present so you don't get shot. So there's all sorts of understandable and not very smart checking out from the present moment that a lot of people do in order to feel better, in order to avoid. And for most therapists, avoidance is very bad. And some people, for instance, are on antidepressants, avoiding the reality of their lives. And in some situations, I completely understand it because maybe their lives are generally torturous. I know some people like that. And some people are just cowards and they're terrified of dealing with the reality of their lives and they use different types of medications to deal with them. And unfortunately, for myself and everybody else included, cowardice is the ordinary state of human affairs because we're not designed to sit with feeling terrible all the time. We're designed to feel bad and do something about it. So, and number 4, autonomy with technocratic management. Yes, we've turned over our autonomy to our smartphones, our therapists, our counselors, spiritual counselors, with gurus, bosses, teachers. Yeah. So I agree with all 4 of those things. Drew says, my favorite professors in grad and undergrad are/were the jolly old psychologists. Generally well-adjusted people and want to give back to younger people. Yeah. And the older folks are usually the ones that know things that we do not know. It's not usually your influencer dude who's read 5 peer-reviewed papers that are garbage to justify his choices of peptides or whatever. It is people who've survived a very long time which is a miracle. So for me, this is just me at least, I agree with Nick that we've created a therapeutic or technocratic management state that is not actually allowing us to be mentally more well-adjusted and healthier, whatever that word means. I believe that if all of us wanted to live better lives, even marginally better lives, we would probably let go of the technocratic state, the therapy state, and focus more on the simple things that actually make our life better, like family and friends, sleeping a little better, eating a little better, moving a little more, laughing a little more, etc. It's really absurd, in my opinion. If you have a therapist that doesn't focus on your physical health, if you have a therapist that doesn't help you exercise appropriately or eat appropriately or whatever, and appropriate is contextual, by the way. So whatever you need to do to improve your physical health, your therapist should be doing with you. If your therapist is just caring about your thoughts, that person's probably not going to help you a whole lot, usually. So let's look at all the things that matter, not just what we think, because that PR story, that terrible story we tell ourselves, that fake, I call it terrible because it's fake. It's not real. You know, the PR company in your brain, between your ears, is actually not real. So it's really important to focus on the observable patterns of behavior that we can actually do something about in a very minimal way to make our lives better. So quality therapy doesn't just include talking about your childhood or your trauma or your personality or your cognitive distortions or whatever. It also involves looking at your current habits. Do you respect yourself enough to eat a little bit better? Do you respect yourself enough to sleep a little bit better? Do you respect yourself enough to move a little more and take better care of your body and stretch and all these kinds of things? Like, all these signs of self-disrespect are extremely important. Do you have the boundaries you need to with the people around you? You know, these are all classic signs of self-respect that most people don't do with regularity and frequency. Now, there might be some super deep reasons why we don't respect ourselves, and sometimes depth-oriented therapy is really, really good for that. Some people need that. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people need to just start making incremental changes in these habits or in these relationships. Assert yourself just a little bit more with your romantic partner, with your friends, with your family. Hold better boundaries just a little bit more every day with people. And it gets a little bit easier over time, which is how most people evolve, by the way, and progress and get healthier. So I really hope you all understand that I'm not anti-therapy, I'm not anti-depth or anything like that. I just think it's really crazy that we care so much about all this therapy stuff and therapy jargon and introspection and being deep. Deep is certainly good and useful, but also so is being shallow. So is being in a flow state, you know? You're going to be the most well-adjusted when you live in a flow state compared to if you have some deep and profound understanding of your childhood and how your personality became the way it did, for instance. So, all of that is to say, I think Mark Andreessen's correct. Thinking hasn't done a whole lot for most people. Introspection, sometimes useful, sometimes navel-gazing and narcissistic. Which is which, and when is it? Maybe you should talk to somebody about it and get some feedback from your family and your friends and your spouse and the people you're dating. The people that you respect that are doing better than you in life might have some idea. Your elders might have some idea about how you could be doing. They're your elders for a reason. Even if they're screwed up people, they might still have some wisdom for you that you don't need an expert in a blue jacket for instance. So, that's my little rant for today. I hope it all makes sense. I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form for people. We're going to end a little early today because I got to get going. But I really hope this has made sense to you. And we will talk a little bit more next week about delusions, about modern life and lifestyles, and probably some more grist from the mill from Nick Tabor and other people. So I hope that you all understand that this is a podcast that is not specifically mental health advice for you, your family, or your loved ones. This is just me stating opinions out loud into a microphone on a camera for the sake of both entertainment and for the sake of maybe pushing back on things that our profession holds sacred that aren't so good for most people. I think that there's a lot of pro-therapy talk in the world, and that's all good, but there's not a lot of nuance anymore. There's just influencers who don't talk about the complicated realities of people and feelings, like some of the posts I discussed today. So I'm here to help you see things more clearly and to have a more refined perspective on some of these popular notions about anxiety and introspection and all this kind of stuff. So please like, share, and subscribe, and I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form. And as always, I like to end this podcast with a joke. So without further delay, I had a patient years ago. Nice guy, interesting creature. So I've had the luxury of working with different types of phobias in my career. Phobias, just so you know, are irrational fears, not rational fears. And this individual had a phobia of flowers, which I have never heard of in my entire life. I was shocked when he walked into my office and said, I have this irrational fear of flowers. I was like, what happened? Were you assaulted by somebody who was a florist or something? And I didn't actually say that, but I was curious, like what could have happened that would have made you afraid of flowers? Anyways, so, he lives in a big city. He lives in an all concrete building, blah, 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 no plants around. So anyways, we start talking about exposure therapy and managing anxiety and all this stuff. And it goes fairly well. Simultaneously, he's starting to date, which is awesome because, for a lot of people, finding relationships while they're struggling with mental health issues, hard. But he was dating and had kind of a typical girlfriend for a dude like him. And they did the usual first date stuff, coffee, get to know each other. Second date, I think they went to a movie. And, that session, he came back and said, she wants to go to a botanical garden for our third date. And so I was a little concerned because we hadn't really done much exposure therapy. We'd only seen each other for like 3 sessions. So he was still pretty, overwhelmed when he even saw pictures of flowers. Whatever. Anyways, so he talks about how to handle the anxiety going to this botanical garden with his girlfriend, which I praised him for. It's a good idea to expose yourself for sure. That's how exposure therapy works. And so he wanted to go. I supported him in going. We came up with the plan for how he's going to cope with the anxiety being around all these flowers at the botanical garden. And apparently it worked because he came back the next week and he said, I think I'm cured. And I said, okay, what happened? That's a drastic change. What happened? 4 sessions in, what happened? So he tells me the story about going to the botanical garden, having a lot of anxiety in the car before parking and walking in and all this stuff. And then when he got inside, he noticed that, it was a fairly quiet place and serene place, and it was a nice place. And he liked that he got to hold her hand and walk around the botanical garden and all this stuff, which is good. And so they walk next to this part of the botanical garden with all the bulbs and things like that, like roses and etc., tulips. And he said that she pulled me close while we were at the garden and she kissed me while we were staring at the roses. And while she was kissing me, I noticed the smell of the roses. And I felt immediately like 10 times better and happy for the first time in months. He said, what do you think, Dr. Lockwood? And I said, well, sometimes, apparently, all you really need to do is stop and smell the roses. All right, I hope you all have a good rest of your week. I hope you eat, sleep, move, and laugh. I hope you take good care of yourselves and good care of the people in your lives. Have good food, have good sex. I will see you next week for another episode of UnShrink Me on Saturday. Bye-bye.